Of course, I guess I'll get back into that for a second, but won't be there too long. But you know, people, we naturally, I think, are hardwired to have empathy. And when we see somebody else hurt, we sort of naturally feel that hurt. And when somebody's working in a slaughterhouse where all they're doing all day long is hurting and killing others, they have to sort of cut off that humane part of them, that empathy, and begin doing many other bad things. You know, slaughterhouse workers sometimes take that brutality home, and it's an ugly world. And unfortunately, this violence can jump the species barrier. Cruelty to animals oftentimes relates to cruelty to people. Violence is violence, and violence, unfortunately, can become the norm. And on factory farms today, violence is the norm. But human beings are very social animals. We tend to do what those around us do. We learn from those around us. So people that work in slaughterhouses see bad things happening, and they're encouraged to do bad things, and then they start rationalizing, justifying, and normalizing bad things. But I think a lot of those people really don't like what they're doing. I mean, how could you? How could you get pleasure out of such violence? And so, you know, our movement is not about condemning people. It's, I think, love the sin or hate the sin is a good sort of mantra. And I think of people like Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, with understanding there can be no hatred. Or Gandhi, who talks about how the goal is to bring people to their senses, not to their knees. You know, good people sometimes, and in fact often, do bad things. And our hope is that we can provide alternatives and show a different way. And that's what Farm Sanctuary is about. That's why the Adopt a Turkey program started back in 1986. It was a way to deal with a holiday that was very hard for vegetarians. You know, this national holiday celebrated around the carcass of a dead bird. So we came up with a different idea. Let's celebrate the lives of these animals instead of their deaths. And I think there's something that's inherently, people inherently like that. You know, there's, I think, more joy in life than in death, more joy in giving and supporting others than in extracting and killing others, which is what this whole factory farming business is about. But you know, in this movement, animal people can sometimes feel a little bit righteous about our position. And so it's also important for us to recognize that, you know, even the most vegan is not perfect. And when we first started doing this work and we were rescuing animals from dead piles and taking them to the local veterinarian, the veterinarian was a little bit surprised that, you know, we were spending so much money to take care of animals that were economically worth very little. And so they looked at us in a kind of funny way, and then they looked at us even more funny when one day we found a sick rat on the farm. And we called the veterinarian and said, we have this rat that's in pretty bad shape. We think he's probably going to have to be euthanized. Can you look at him? And they kind of hemmed and hawed a little bit, and they finally agreed to look at the rat, and he was in bad shape, and they euthanized him. And then a couple weeks after that, our sheep had had parasites. They had worms. So I called the veterinarian and I said, we have this worm here. And there was a long silence on the other end. And the vet kind of said, well, okay, what do you want us to do with the worm? And the worm was a parasite. So we wanted to find out what sort of medication to give to the sheep to treat them for these worms. So, you know, the point is that, you know, in living, we're going to cause harm. But we should live in a way that is as conscious as possible, and I think does as little harm as possible. And doing that, you know, makes us feel good too. You know, kindness to others really enriches ourselves. And how we treat other animals, actually, I believe, says more about who we are than about who the animals are. You know, Gandhi said you can judge the moral progress of a nation by its treatment of animals. And when it comes to farm animals, that rings so true to me. And the more I am immersed in these issues, the more obvious it is. You know, these animals are completely at our mercy. We mass produce them, we control every aspect of their lives, and if we treat them with no kindness and no mercy, that says something about us. And in this industry, that's become the norm. And in how we eat in our country, also, bad has become normal. We eat in a way that is supporting enormous cruelty, and and most citizens, when they hear about it, don't like it. So people are unwittingly supporting this factory farming abusive system. So then one of the responses is, well, I don't want to see it, I don't want to know, don't tell me about it. So then people live in this sort of state of denial, in this cognitive dissonance between their own basic empathy and desire to live humanely. And I think most people want to consider themselves as humane and compassionate. I mean, there's a few miscreants, perhaps, that are proud of being cruel and mean, but not too many. That's the rare individual. Most people want to be compassionate, but most citizens in this country are unwittingly supporting abuse. So, but they've learned to do it not to be cruel, but just because that's what everybody else is doing. And most people, again, because we're social animals, we tend to do what those around us do, start adapting habits that aren't necessarily healthy. And you know, I grew up eating meat without thinking about it. I think most people grow up eating meat without thinking about it. And once we start thinking about these issues and start making choices that are aligned with our own values, we start seeing a big shift. And I think one of the reasons people are so sometimes defensive when vegetarians or vegans, you know, raise these issues is that they, in their own guts, feel kind of guilty and kind of uneasy about their own behavior and feel like, you know, I'm really not living the way I feel is best. So I think, you know, we want to encourage people ultimately to make choices that are aligned with their own values and aligned with their own interests. And it doesn't make sense to be eating food that gives us heart disease and cancer, but that's what we're doing in this country. It also doesn't make sense to support an agricultural system that's contributing to the worst environmental problems this world has ever faced, which is what we're also doing by supporting animal agriculture. The United Nations put out a report a couple of years ago called Livestock's Long Shadow, talking about how the livestock industry is one of the top contributors to the most serious environmental problems we're facing today. So these problems are becoming more and more apparent, and it's because of the work of everybody here and because of the growing awareness about these issues. And each of us, every day, can play a role in creating a different kind of world. And, you know, coming to an event like this is something that I really enjoy doing. You know, oftentimes when I'm out there, and I'm talking a lot these days with factory farming folks, I was actually invited to speak to the National Pork Board in Iowa about a month ago. That was pretty wild. And, you know, I opened up by talking about how, you know, we really appreciate the hard work farmers do. We respect the fact that farmers are feeding the world. But the key question is, what's the most efficient and appropriate way for farmers to feed the world? Is it by growing grain and then harvesting that grain and feeding it to animals and raising the animals and then killing the animals? Or is it by growing plant foods and feeding them directly to people? It's clearly by producing plant foods instead of animal foods. So I'm putting these kinds of messages out there, and the response is interesting. Some people are really dug in and they're not wanting to listen to it, but others aren't listening. And after my talk, a few people came up to me and said, you know, my cousin's a vegetarian and my sister's a vegan. And so even within this animal farming business, there are people who are vegans who are expressing these sentiments, and farming people who are in animal agriculture are starting to recognize that us vegans are actually people too. We're not this sort of strange race of whatever, you know? We're actually humans that share a lot of the same concerns that others do. And so, you know, our movement cannot just be sort of a vegan club. We need to expand and be about inclusion. A friend of mine, Will Tuttle, who wrote The World Peace Diet, talks about radical inclusion. Being a vegan is about radical inclusion, including other animals in our sphere of compassion. And I think also it means including other people who are not traditionally vegans or aligned with our vegan worldview, but who are living in a way